November 14th, 1930. America had been in the throes of the Great Depression for over a year. Across the country, families were struggling. But in Westchester, Pennsylvania, a picturesque town of around 13,000 people, November 14th wasn't a night about hardship. Instead, it was a night of escape.
A lot of decoration, real grandeur. This is certainly a pleasure palace, is what somebody called it.
The interior was very, very lovely. It put you in mind of the big cities like New York.
And then on top of that, the really exciting new innovation of moving pictures with sound made it a great attraction.
That great attraction was the Warner Theater, once called the Showplace of Chester County. Behind the theater's intricate Art Deco doors, there were 1,650 seats from floor to balcony.
There were other movie theaters in Westchester. There was the Garden, the Rialto, but they didn't have beauty at all. They were just a building, and they did not show necessarily the quality of movies that the Warner theaters showed.
The grand opening of the Warner Theater on November 14th was a night that began with the Star-Spangled Banner. Then a dedication by Westchester Burgess George L. Brinton and President of the Borough Council, Paul McElry. Later, there was an appearance by child star Davy Lee, and the night ended with the comedy The Life of the Party. From that night on, the Warner was the place to be.
On a Friday night, Saturday night, there are photographs of crowds of people walking along the street illuminated by the lights from the big Warner sign out front. It would have been quite a popular place.
The lobby was always loaded. People gathered there and talked, and you always knew a lot of people because at one time, you almost knew everybody in Westchester.
One of the things that local business leaders said at the time was how thrilled they were about it because it would attract more people to town and hopefully have some business spill over into their establishments as well.
This was the height of the motion picture industry. There were 5 major studios that ran Hollywood: Warner Brothers, RKO, Paramount, Lowe's, and 20th Century Fox. And with the introduction of sound, Warner Brothers went to the top of the pack, first with a score to Don Juan in 1926, and then with spoken lines in 1927's groundbreaking The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson. These talkies made Warner Brothers incredibly successful, and they quickly decided to expand their empire by acquiring theater corporations. Among them, the Stanley Corporation of America.
The company that created probably the biggest chain in this area prior to the Big Five coming in and taking over everything was called the Stanley Corporation of America. And it was founded by 2 guys down in Philadelphia who bought up little independent theaters all around here and had about 250 of them at the time when Warner went and bought them out.
The Stanley Corporation bid on the parcel of land for the Warner Theater in June of 1929. They presented plans for an amazing $700,000 theater that would be large, lavish, and loud.
The Warner Theater here was built with sound system is incorporated into it, whereas the other 2 theaters here in Westchester had to go and add sound equipment afterwards.
And that isn't the only thing the Warner had on the competition.
People don't usually talk about it so much, but another kind of technology that influenced this was actually the creation of air conditioning for buildings. That would have been something that would have been real attractive here in Westchester in the summertime, as you can imagine.
In the early days, the Warner Theater proved to be not only an escape from the heat, but from the hardships of the poor economy. However, had the timing been just a little different, the theater might not have been built at all.
The Warner Theater was actually planned prior to the beginning of the Great Depression. So Warner Company acquired the land for the theater in the summer of 1929, and of course it was the fall of 1929 when the Depression started.
So work continued. And though most of the labor and parts were from New York City, the presence of the Warner Theater brought great comfort to the townspeople and business owners alike.
The fact that they followed through on their plans, I'm sure, was encouraging to people who were worried about the future. They created about 30 jobs at the theater, ushers and ticket takers and so forth. They were all filled locally. In fact, one newspaper clipping mentions the ushers, who were mostly either Westchester High School students or Westchester State Teacher College students, and describes how they went through a rigorous military training for 3 weeks in order to go and be able to serve as ushers in the Warner Theater.
The Warner's architects were C.W. and George Rapp of Chicago, who also designed Times Square's Paramount Theater. At the time, their hallmark was Art Deco movie theaters across the East Coast.
The architectural style of the Warner Theater was called Art Deco, although actually at the time people referred to it as a sort of a modernist style. And according to various experts on the subject, it was an attempt to go and bridge sort of the industrial look with consumer design.
And above it all, there was the gorgeous marquee, with its bright lights that seemed to call on folks from miles around.
Westchester was already a center for certainly the local farmers. It was a big market town. It was also an industrial center starting about the 1880s when some of the big factories came in. And so even though the population of Westchester was about 13,000 at the time, there were many, many more people that came here during the day and also came here in the evenings for recreation.
The Warner was so grand and beautiful, in fact, that a rumor has dogged it, that it wasn't intended for Westchester, Pennsylvania at all, but instead Westchester County, New York, and it was only built here accidentally.
The myth of the Warner Theater having been designed for Westchester, New York, and accidentally placed here in Westchester, Pennsylvania, certainly has long legs. A lot of people have told me about all this. As far as the origin of it, I mean, one thing is because the scale of this thing was so far beyond anything else here in the borough, and it probably reminded people of the kinds of things that they'd seen down in Philadelphia or certainly New York City. It was much larger and much more grand than anything else that ever existed in Westchester up till that time.
As the years went on, the way people went to see movies changed. Audiences were more interested in the films than the theaters they played in. And for a while, the Warner changed with the times. But even with the recognition as a classic movie theater, and with tickets discounted below the competition, the Warner soon became too expensive to run. In 1978, the theater was run by Robert Clement, who'd enjoyed the theater as a boy. When he couldn't sustain the Warner, the town rallied behind it and managed to keep it alive until the mid-1980s.
The theater actually went out of business in the early, I guess it was late 70s, and then there was an attempt to go and revive it in the early 80s. But by 1985, the two new owners had decided that they wanted to go and close the theater and actually demolish the building. That prompted a pretty huge controversy here in town, including citizens groups that hired lawyers to go and fight it. And it was one of those things that filled the newspapers for a year or more in 1985.
But in the fall of 1986, almost 56 years after the Warner's doors had opened, the theater was closed for good.
When the Warner closed, it felt like an end of an era, and it was in reality. It was kind of sad, very sad. It still is.
For many, the Warner will serve as a fond memory of a simpler time, when going to the movies was a chance to take a break from life's hardships and get away for a while.